David couldn't believe what he was reading in the official HOA letter. After years of peacefully living in his family home, the neighborhood association had suddenly reclassified his back acre as common property. This land had been in his family for 3 generations, and now they were simply taking it. When David confronted Eleanor Winters, the new HOA president, she dismissed his concerns with practiced authority. "No mistake," Eleanor stated firmly. "Our professional survey shows your grandfather's maps were incorrect. The board voted unanimously last night." "Without telling me? I've been paying taxes on that land for 15 years, David argued. "The HOA bylaws don't require notification for property corrections," she replied coolly. "We're planning a wonderful club facility there. Everyone will benefit. Even you." That evening, David discovered his neighbors Tyler and Samantha Morgan had known about the plan all along. During a confrontation about their noisy party, they casually revealed the club would feature lap pools, cabanas, and a cocktail bar, all on David's rightful property. "It's not personal," Tyler said with a shrug. "Eleanor showed us the real property lines. Your grandfather's maps were wrong." Walking home, David realized this wasn't just about an unwanted community amenity. This was a calculated land grab, and somehow everyone except him had been in on the scheme. As he retrieved his grandfather's old wooden chest from the attic that night, examining the yellowed property documents inside, a plan began forming in his mind. The HOA had no idea what they were about to step into. David couldn't sleep that night. Spreading his grandfather's yellowed property documents across the kitchen table, he compared them to the modern survey Eleanor had attached to her letter. Something wasn't right. Grandfather's boundaries followed natural landmarks: the creek, the old oak tree, the rocky ridge. But the HOA map ignored these completely, drawing straight lines that conveniently cut off his most beautiful acre. Then David noticed small writing in the corner of his grandfather's deed that he'd never paid attention to before. It referenced county survey markers from 1952. If those markers still existed. "I need help," David muttered, scrolling through his phone contacts until he found James Jacobson, a surveyor who'd worked with his father years ago. Despite the late hour, he sent a text. The next morning, David called in sick to work and drove to the county records office. His cousin Vince worked there, and he needed access to the original surveys. "These HOA people," Vince muttered as they dug through dusty files. "They're getting bolder every year." "Ah, here it is." The 1952 survey clearly showed David's property extended beyond what even he had thought. The creek had moved after a flood in the 70s, but property lines didn't move with it. David's phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Community announcement. Groundbreaking for Pine Crest Club begins Tuesday. Please clear any personal items from the designated area." Tuesday. That gave him just 5 days. That afternoon, Jacobson arrived with his equipment. "Let's find those original markers," he said. "If they're still there, the HOA has a big problem." They worked until sunset, careful to stay out of sight. Under years of overgrown grass, Jacobson's metal detector found the first marker. His eyebrows shot up. "According to this, your property extends another 50 feet that way, which includes part of the Morgan's new pool." They found 3 more markers before dark, each confirming what Grandpa's maps showed. David's land was actually larger than what he'd been maintaining. "There's more," Jacobson said quietly. "See this ridge? The geological survey from the 50s notes it as a potential archaeological site. Native American artifacts were found here in the 40s. David remembered Grandpa's stories about arrowheads and pottery shards. What does that mean legally? If confirmed, it could trigger a historical preservation review. No development allowed. The pieces of David's trap were falling into place. The HOA was about to learn a valuable lesson about respecting property rights and history. David woke before sunrise to an alarming text message that wasn't meant for him. "Meeting tomorrow 7 a.m. Eleanor's house. Bringing contractors to mark pool placement on your acre. Don't tell David." They had meant to text someone else, but now David knew they weren't waiting until Tuesday. He set his alarm for 5 a.m. He needed to be ready before they arrived. With the first light of dawn, Jacobson returned in an unmarked truck, equipment hidden under tarps. "If we're right about those markers," he whispered as they worked in the dim light, "the HOA survey missed nearly 2 acres of your land." Dew soaked David's jeans as they hammered in flags exactly where Grandpa's deed indicated. The last marker went directly through the corner of Tyler and Samantha's fancy new deck. "They built that deck last month," David told Jacobson. "Convenient timing," Jacobson replied, checking his GPS device. According to county permits, they built it after the HOA's new survey, almost like they knew where the new boundary would be. As the sun climbed higher, they heard vehicles approaching. "Hide the equipment," David whispered. "Let's see what they do." From behind his garden shed, they watched Eleanor arrive with 3 other board members and a landscaping crew. They unloaded spray paint and measuring tools, laughing as they marked out locations for cabanas, a tiki bar and a massive pool, all on David's property. "This spa feature will be perfect right here," Eleanor said, marking a big X through David's grandmother's rose garden that he'd maintained for 20 years. Later that morning, David visited the local historical society where his mom had volunteered. The director, Maria, greeted him warmly. "Your timing is interesting," she said, pulling out a folder. "Someone from the county just requested all records about your property. Eleanor Winters." She seemed very interested in whether any historical claims had ever been filed. David now understood this wasn't just about a community pool. It was about property values and development deals. That evening, massive construction lights mounted on the Morgans' property suddenly blazed on, aimed directly at David's house. The glare was blinding, pouring through every window. Squinting against the light, David could make out figures moving on his property, removing his boundary flags. The HOA was escalating, but they had no idea what they were walking into. David was jolted awake at 4:30 a.m. by the rumble of heavy machinery. Through his window, he spotted a massive yellow bulldozer creeping toward his back acre. Grabbing his phone, deed papers, and a flashlight, he raced outside in his slippers. "Stop right now," David shouted, waving his flashlight wildly. The operator, a confused-looking man in a hard hat, finally cut the engine. "Look, buddy, I'm just following orders. Got paperwork right here saying this is HOA property." As they argued, 3 vehicles pulled up. Eleanor stepped out of her Range Rover wearing a tailored pantsuit despite the early hour, followed by the Morgans and 2 men carrying briefcases. "Mr. Jackson," Eleanor called with a tight smile. "I see you're an early riser too. Wonderful. You can watch the groundbreaking ceremony." "I've already called Sheriff Davis," David replied, holding up his phone. "He's on his way. You're trespassing on private property." "Actually," Eleanor countered, unfolding a document, "according to the county survey we commissioned, this land falls within community boundaries." The distant wail of a police siren cut through the tension. Sheriff Davis, David's father's old fishing buddy, arrived looking irritated. "What's going on here?" he asked, adjusting his belt. While they argued about permits, David's 78-year-old neighbor Rose approached with a stack of yellowed papers. "Your grandfather and I prepared for something like this years ago," she told David, handing him the documents. The HOA tried the same tactic in '89 with the Henderson property. David skimmed the papers. Original meeting minutes showing the true boundaries had been officially recorded with the state, not just the county. Faced with this new evidence and Sheriff Davis's questions about permits, Eleanor reluctantly announced they would postpone today's work to sort out these technicalities. The emergency HOA meeting had started 20 minutes early, another of Eleanor's tricks. David pushed through the double doors of Ridge Community Center, clutching his leather briefcase containing the fruits of his all-night research session with Jacobson. "Before anyone votes," David announced loudly, "you should know what you're actually voting on." Despite Eleanor's protests, board member Diana Chun moved to allow David to speak. He laid out 3 large maps on the presentation table. "This first document is the original 1952 survey showing the natural creek boundary that defined my family's property," David explained. "Our recent certified survey shows my property includes all of this area, which unfortunately for some of you includes land you thought was yours." Gasps erupted as neighbors recognized the implications. "That's impossible," Tyler Morgan sputtered, his face going pale. "Unfortunately not," David replied. "Your swimming pool extends 12 feet onto my legal property. And Eleanor's home addition from last spring? It's 18 feet over the line." The final blow came when David revealed the artifacts discovered during their survey, arrowheads dating back approximately 800 years. "I've already filed for historical preservation status," he explained, "which means no development can occur within 200 feet of the discovery site." But Eleanor's mistake came when she shouted about investors waiting and contracts signed, information the board knew nothing about. The room erupted in questions as David revealed documents showing Eleanor and her husband had created an LLC that would profit from the development. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, David knew the trap had been sprung. The HOA had walked right into it just as he'd planned. A week after the dramatic meeting, David was startled to see Eleanor's fancy car pulling into his driveway. The entire HOA board spilled out like angry hornets from a disturbed nest. "We need to talk," Eleanor said, her voice icier than winter. She clutched a leather folder so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Your little stunt at the meeting has forced us to involve our attorneys," she continued, gesturing to a nervous man in an expensive suit who kept checking his watch. "Mr. Peterson, HOA legal counsel," the man mumbled, barely looking at David. David crossed his arms. "Funny, I was about to call my lawyer too. And the county assessor. And maybe the local news station." Eleanor's face twitched as the other board members exchanged worried glances. "Perhaps we could discuss this inside?" Peterson suggested, his voice cracking slightly. "We can talk right here where the neighbors can see us," David insisted. "I'm done with secret meetings and backroom deals." Indeed, Mrs. Garcia was watering her flowers next door, clearly eavesdropping. Rose had positioned her lawn chair on her front porch with a clear view. Even old Mr. Jenkins had his window open, his hearing aid turned up high. After a tense negotiation, Eleanor finally asked the question David had been waiting for, "What do you want?" David laid out his terms calmly: a binding agreement with severe penalties if broken, the club facility to be built on the actual common land by the front entrance, revised noise rules with real enforcement, a public apology, a position on the Architectural Review Committee, and a fund for property line verification for every home in the neighborhood, paid for by HOA reserves. "Impossible," Eleanor exploded. "We'd have to raise dues," Keith complained. "Or cut your executive compensation," David suggested with a smile. "Your choice." After frantic whispering among themselves, Eleanor finally agreed to all of David's demands, but insisted on a non-disclosure clause. "Too late for that," David replied, nodding toward the neighbors who had witnessed everything. As the defeated board members shuffled back to their cars, David overheard Keith whisper to Eleanor, "Why did we agree to all this?" "Because he didn't mention the tax reassessment that would happen if he reported the correct property lines to the county," Eleanor hissed back. "We'd all be ruined." David smiled to himself. He hadn't even thought of that angle. Sometimes the best victories come from letting your enemies imagine their own worst fears. 6 months later, after Eleanor's final desperate revenge attempt backfired spectacularly, the new leisure center broke ground on the proper community land. David was appointed chairman of both the Architectural Review Committee and the newly created Property Rights Committee. As he sat on his porch with Rose, watching the sunset and celebrating with champagne, David reflected on the journey. "I never wanted a fight," he admitted. "I just wanted what was rightfully mine." Rose nodded. "Sometimes the best trap isn't set with anger but with patience. You gave Eleanor enough rope and she hanged herself." The sweetest victory wasn't just protecting his land but restoring the true meaning of community that his grandfather had valued so much. The HOA had taken David's bait perfectly, never suspecting he'd laid a trap that would protect this place forever. 2 weeks after the confrontation, David unfolded a certified letter with trembling hands. The county tax assessor had completed their review of all Pine Crest Village properties based on the new surveys. Eleanor's property value had increased by 40% due to the undisclosed improvements crossing onto David's land. The Morgans faced similar increases. David's own taxes remained unchanged thanks to the historical designation Jacobson had helped him secure. His doorbell rang and through the peephole, David saw Tyler Morgan standing alone, shifting his weight nervously. "What do you want?" David asked, opening the door just enough to speak. "Can we talk?" Tyler looked different, humbler somehow. "I brought something you should see." Cautiously David let him in. Tyler placed a USB drive on the coffee table. "Eleanor's been planning something big," he explained in a low voice. "After you forced her to apologize, she became obsessed with getting even. She convinced half the board to support her secret project." "What's this?" David asked, picking up the drive. "Everything: emails, plans, fake evidence she created to discredit your property claims." Tyler looked ashamed. "Samantha and I were part of it until we saw how far she was willing to go." "Why turn on her now?" David asked suspiciously. Tyler sighed. "The tax reassessment hit us hard. When I asked Eleanor for help, she laughed and said we were acceptable collateral damage in her war against you. We have kids heading to college soon, we can't afford her revenge games." That evening at the HOA meeting, Eleanor strutted to the podium, triumph glittering in her eyes. "After months of investigation, I've uncovered evidence that will shock this community," she announced, pulling out a folder. The property survey that caused so much trouble was based on fraudulent documentation. Before a vote could be called, David connected Tyler's USB drive to the projector. Eleanor's face drained of color as her own emails appeared on screen, revealing her plot to fabricate evidence against him. That's not real," she stammered. "It came from your own computer, Eleanor," Tyler said, standing with his wife. "We've provided sworn statements about how you asked us to help create fake documents." The vote to suspend Eleanor from the board was unanimous. Later, David received a message from Vince. "University experts finished testing those artifacts Jacobson found. They're not just real, they're rare. State Historical Society wants to talk about a preservation grant." David laughed out loud. Grandfather always told him this land was special, but even he couldn't have guessed how valuable it would become. Not in dollars but in community. The HOA had taken David's bait perfectly, rushing to grab what they thought was easy pickings, never suspecting he'd laid a trap that would protect this place forever. Justice had arrived in unexpected packages, wrapped in preservation orders that not even the most determined HOA could override.